Good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our program, Georgia Women and the History of Conservatism. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an Adult Services Specialist for Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight, we are joined by author Robin M. Morris, who will discuss her new book, Goldwater Girls to Reagan Women, Gender, Georgia, and the Growth of the New Right. Now, I would like to introduce our author for tonight. Robin M. Morris is Associate Professor of History at Agnes Scott College. She researches gender and the political realignment of Georgia after World War II. Her work has appeared in Entering the Fray, Gender, Politics, and Culture in the New South. She holds a PhD in History from Yale University, an MA in Southern Studies from University of Mississippi, and a BA from Queen's University of Charlotte. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Please welcome Robin M. Morris.
Hi, this is interesting because I can't see you, but you can see me. So hello, and thank you for coming here tonight. I see we have people from all over, so this is a great way for all of us to come together at this time. So I wanted to start by saying right now I am in the midst of all of the final grading, right? And that involves my students asking, oh my gosh, how do I pick a topic? We've been through that all semester. So I wanted to start by telling you how I picked my topic and then walking you through some of the research I was able to do here. So I started this back in graduate school where I had intended to write about women and Civil War memory. But then I read a book that I won't name because I didn't like it, and I don't want to slander anyone. But it was a book that made me wonder why there's not an ERA. So that was my very first question that led into my research. So of course I went to every historian's best friend, Google, and searched for it. And that led me, let me share my screen and I'll show you what I found with that. Sorry, play. All right. I'll put this here in case you want I'll also bring this back. But that's my email and that's my Twitter. It's not my Instagram, but it's my Twitter if you'd like to follow me there. But my Google search led me to these two things: a map of unratified states and the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who I'd heard before, but I'd never really given her much thought. If you had told me when I started graduate school, that eventually I would meet Phyllis Schlafly and kind of love all things Phyllis, learn to respect her, I would have thought you were out of your mind. But here I am, and I think she's one of the greatest political organizers that we do not recognize as such in the United States. But I saw this map and I was really fascinated by the South and the West and how these regions really showed up on this map. When I had been in college, I had interned for Kathy Steinberg, who was the state sponsor for the Equal Rights Amendment in Georgia. So I wrote her and I asked her, who is the biggest troublemaker for you during your ERA battle? And she said, some woman named Dunaway. So here's Catherine Dunaway. This is where normally I would ask you to tell me what you think of what she looks like. But she is a grandmother. She was a grandmother, a Boy Scout troop leader. She was all of these things, known for her chocolate cake, Sunday school teacher. This was Catherine Dunaway. And when I asked Phyllis Schlafly why she picked Dunaway to be the leader, she told me that Catherine Dunaway was her first and her best state chairman. Those were her words: my first and my best state chairman for Stop ERA. So Phyllis Schlafly picked Georgia first, organized Georgia first. And this was not just because of her great friendship that had already existed with Catherine Dunaway, but also the significance of Georgia to the Stop ERA battle. Georgia was an unratified state, and I'm going to come back here and just give you a second to look over the text of the Equal Rights Amendment so you're familiar with what we're talking about. This was an amendment that came up in every US Congress, every congressional session since suffrage. And suffrage, of course, is 1920. And this came up every single time and never, ever passed. And then in 1972, it finally made it out of both houses of Congress. So the main section of this is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then the seconds are pretty standard boilerplate for any, if as much as an amendment can have boilerplate language. So this is the text we'll be talking about. This is the text that Phyllis Schlafly worked to defeat, and this is the text that is not in the Constitution today. All right. Okay. So when I talked, unfortunately, Catherine Dunaway had already passed away by the time I started this research, but I was able to meet her co-chairman, and they did use that language of chairman instead of chairperson, her state chair, her co-chairman, Lee Wai-song, who explained to me that Georgia was one of the first ones because our legislature was in session from January to early March. So we were the first ones who would vote on it. And the Stop ERA women knew the importance of that legislative calendar. She recalled, we were just frantic because if we fell, if Georgia went, then at least one of the other states that had withheld their vote, at least one of them would go and would put them over the top. So this language of organizing like a battle really takes off through the whole decade of fighting the amendment. And I think you're all very familiar with the fact that Georgia has a very early session. We have a really hectic January, February, March, and now we're kind of finally in Georgia getting a well-earned breather in politics. Of course, people are fundraising, but we can ignore them for a little bit of time. So the story of the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment really is the story of grassroots organizing. And Dunaway here was one of the best. The women who fought the ERA in Georgia were unpaid volunteers all over the state. They traveled to national conferences where they met women from other states who fought in the same political battles. And these local grassroots networks bled into the national women's networks. So I want to be clear that this is not a story about highly paid political lobbyists. This is not a story about the candidates. And when I began uncovering the stories, I was really shocked at how simple yet how obvious it all seemed. These women, Catherine Dunaway had never even been to college, and she was always very self-conscious about that. But she was really one of the best political strategists I've ever studied, and she's really savvy. So these women did not let a lack of money nor a lack of formal education dull the momentum for their movement. They were also battling a national movement to pass ERA. When it passed the House and Senate, people just thought it was going to sail through. In Georgia, the pro-ERA groups got together and they said, we want to be one of those 38 that passes. There was not even an understanding, there was not even an imagination that the ERA would not pass. They did imagine that Georgia wouldn't pass it, but they hadn't even thought about the amendment not passing. So what feminists of the time and what historians today still fail to understand was the extent of the organizing of conservative women. So I want to say right now that what we misunderstand is that conservative women have this agency. There's a lot of misunderstanding that the women are taking the message from their husbands or that they're listening to the preachers. But what I found was that they were meeting with the preachers. They were bringing the message to their husbands. So we need to give conservative women the credit of the agency. So the women that I am talking about were all doing this on their own accord, and nobody was making them do this work. So I want to pause here with Catherine Dunaway for a little bit because she is so critical for this. This is not her first rodeo, so to speak. She had befriended many Republicans, including Phyllis Schlafly, over the previous decade, building the Republican Party in Georgia. She had baked for Barry Goldwater. She had hosted tea parties that were called two-party tea parties to introduce the Republican Party. I talk about those in the early chapters of my book. She had canvassed the state for Bo Calloway, who was the first real shot at the Republican Party for governor in 1966. She generally worked to introduce the Republican Party, the modern GOP, to white suburban voters. Other things she had done, she's a cold warrior. She had fought the fluoridation of Atlanta's water supply. So if you've ever seen Dr. Strangelove, you can imagine her worried about the fluoride in the water. She had even testified with Phyllis Schlafly before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1964 against disarmament. So she was well known and well connected in conservative circles in Georgia. So by the time the ERA came out, all she had to do was pick up her phone. So this shows you the network that she had, and you can see her up. My cursor has disappeared, but you can see her up at the top with Levi Song. So they would just have to make those few phone calls, and they had this phone tree that would eventually get them into every district in the state of Georgia. Likewise, anyone at the grassroots level in Lawrenceville and Norcross and Doraville could call up the phone tree and get to Phyllis Schlafly within a matter of 5 or 6 phone calls. So this was the national organization of the entire Stop ERA movement. This Stop ERA structure that flowed from Schlafly, you would have seen, this is just the Georgia map, but Schlafly would be one level up. To the local level meant that every legislator in Georgia heard opposition to the ERA from his or her own constituents. They relied on women all over Georgia to contact their local representatives and senators. The letters of opposition came from within the legislator's district. So they could talk about, we don't want the Berkmar, I think, in Gwinnett County football team, or I can talk about my state champion back in the day, Tucker Tigers. Don't want them having to have girls on the football team, and those letters were coming in, talking about how it would affect the local area, the local school districts, all of this. And that's in contrast to the pro-ERA groups that were just organizing in Atlanta. And lobbying from the base of Atlanta. So this was really an effective strategy to have that statewide movement. So let me see. So the ERA, I'll bring it up again, was a local issue for them. A lot of times we forget to imagine how things at the top look as local issues, but there were many things at play. They could talk about the local boys who were in Vietnam, and what it would mean. There were a lot of letters talking about how having women in the foxholes would really disrupt national security and harm the effort in Vietnam. They talked about women taking men's jobs. And this was at a time when national unemployment was at about 9%. And Phyllis Schlafly blamed that high unemployment on the fact that women had flooded the workplace and men could not find the jobs to take care of their families. Stop ERA was also warning that women who did stay home to work could be punished by the amendment and that husbands would have to pay Social Security. So there were lots of different reasons that they were working with to say we don't to convince people not to support the amendment. I'm sorry, this is very strange. Usually I have an audience that I can play with at this time, so this is kind of a strange moment for me. So they were worried about drafting daughters. They were worried about women in the military who might tempt husbands to cheat. There were some I was about to say emails. There were some letters about that. But really, the main thing that they were talking to Southern legislators about was the uncertainty that the Supreme Court would be the ultimate decider about the meaning of this and the significance of this amendment. And you have to remember that this is a South that is just about not even 20 years outside of Brown versus Board of Education. They've had the school prayer amendments. They've had the free speech in schools amendments. They've had a busing case that just happened, the Charlotte Swan v. Charlotte Meck case that said that busing was constitutional. So all of these things that had chipped away at Southern segregation were really threatening them. So the idea of leaving it up to the Supreme Court was terrifying to Southern state legislators. So that was the biggest thing that they had going for them. So they argued, the Stop ERA organizers said it's better to stick with what we know, change the laws at the local level. If you don't like that women are paid less, change that law. If you don't like that women can't be taxi drivers at night, change that law. So they're looking at encouraging people to change the local level, state level laws, but not to do this blanket amendment because of the uncertainty of what that could do. So the Georgia Stop ERA was one of the first to organize, and they had organized so completely in the first few months that this amendment did not even make it out of the legislature, out of committee for a full vote in 1973. I'll stop sharing just so I can see you for a second and I'll come back to it. I think I can, well, yeah, nope. Sorry, I've lost my cursor, so I'll just keep going. So Governor Jimmy Carter warned pro-ERA groups that the letters to legislators were running 9-1 against the amendment in 1973. So he is pro-ERA and he's putting out this message like, hey guys, hey women, you really need to get better organized because Stop ERA is really getting the message across. So passage starts to look really uncertain. And throughout 1973, the conservative women kept organizing. Even though the session was over in March, they continued organizing. They had learned through the Goldwater campaign and the Callaway campaign, there are no off years in politics. There are only pre-election years. So they take that message into this movement and they start writing letters to all of the legislators to assess the level of support for the amendment. So in Sandersville, one person reported to Dunaway that in her district, we've heard from 20 of the men, 8 are against, 5 for, and 7 undecided. So Catherine Dunaway was keeping sort of a scorecard of who was for and who was against each of these. They were meeting with legislators, but they were also meeting with people who might run for office, who are thinking about running for office, trying to recruit. They were meeting with local pastors, and they were recruiting new volunteers into their movement in these quote unquote off months. The ERA did not get out of committee until 1974, when the Special Judiciary Committee passed the ERA with no recommendation to the full House, and Dunaway was ready. So on the day of that Stop ERA vote, she made sure that each legislature got a freshly baked loaf of bread. So it was still fresh and you could smell it. And it had a note saying, "From the bread maker to the bread winner, stop ERA." And this gift spoke volumes to the largely male legislature. And the breadwinner was assumed, of course, to be male. And he made the money and the laws to support a housewife and children. The bread maker, assumed to be female, stayed home to raise the children and maintain the household. So this idea of the fresh bread and the message reinforced the idea of a head of a household and a heart of a household, and the role that each played in that protection of the family. But what the legislators did not know was that all those efforts had taken up Dunaway's time. So she sent a thank you note after this to Mr. Chester Gray of Mom's Bakery in Atlanta for the donation of the many small loaves of your delicious bread. She also didn't even think up the idea. She had read about it in one of Phyllis Schlafly's newsletters that the Arizona and Missouri Stop ERA had already had success with their bread project that put the Libbers on the defensive. The National Stop ERA network freed women from the need to develop strategy and allowed them to implement proven methods to get their message across. Eventually, they began to organize a Valentine's lunch. This was an annual event because this is really the only holiday during the session. You have to remember this is also before the King holiday. So Valentine's was the only holiday during the session, and they would host a luncheon event for the legislators. And Wysong told me that she thought they were effective because they would feed anybody who came to the table, any staffers and anyone, whether they were pro or against ERA, while the pro ERA groups gave out chocolates only to the people who had voted with them. So she thought that maybe the way to a man's heart was through his stomach. So other things they would do as they went on, after the bread project was so successful, then they started bringing home baked goods all the time because those are also cheap. So they're so cheap you don't have to declare them on any kind of forms. I know that's in the news now of how much does an elected official or an appointed judge need to disclose. But cookies, cakes, those are cheap, right? Because no one knows how much butter we actually have to pay to put in them. So when I interviewed Catherine Dunaway's son, Marshall, he remembered accompanying his mother to the legislature on one visit, and she marveled that she could walk into any legislator's office unannounced and just drop off a cake and say, "Stop ERA." So she knew the favorite cake flavor of every single legislator in the state of Georgia. And she would organize, you take it to that one. You're from his district. You take him the spice cake. You take him the chocolate cake. Apparently, she made a very good chocolate cake. So these gestures of baked goods granted these conservative women access to legislators whose schedules were too packed for appointments, but they learned that nobody is too busy for a homemade cake. In 1979 alone, Catherine Dunaway reported that Stop ERA volunteers served 500 lunches at the Capitol, and they had so many women up there you couldn't get around, she reported. So there's a great description that Rosalind Carter had of remembering how packed it was and all of the smells of this fresh baked food as she went through, and she had walked through with her ERA yes button. and, talked about that, her memory of sort of coming out for the ERA. So the legislators debated the amendment for 4 hours on the state floor in 1974, but they finally voted it down in a 107-70 vote. Some of the people against it would say, where would we have been when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor if we had to line up men and women equally? Another warned that the amendment stinks of communism. And they really focused on the amendment as a Cold War amendment and a national security threat. And then after this, the women went to work on the fall campaigns, writing thank you notes to the legislators who had voted against the amendment and encouraged other local women to do the same. So the breads, cakes, meetings, and thank you notes showed how the women were fighting feminism with femininity. And they were performing these gender roles that they wanted to protect. And this was really something that they were able to take on repeatedly in fighting that feminism with femininity. I just want to make one more point of what they were able to do. Here's a cartoon that's sort of mocking the women. You can see that it's called the Tote and Fetch Brigade, of these women sort of delivering, actually literally putting in his mouth, food to the legislators, and how the legislator is eating it up, right? So another thing that they would do is be sure to train all of the women for the outreach opportunities, because many of them had never been involved in politics. They were not certain about their ability to do public speaking. So at the state meetings and at the national meetings, they would practice, and they would have their hair done by a professional. That Phyllis Schlafly would bring in a makeup artist to teach them how to do their makeup for television, told them to wear jewelry, not too much. If you're over 40, so I'm breaking the rule, but if you're over 40, don't show neck, wear solid colors. And then they would present to each other and critique each other and give each other tips on how to meet. They also had mock meetings with legislators. They would have mock meetings with preachers. So they went into any meeting prepared. They also regularly did mock debates. Catherine Dunaway had a temper, so she very rarely did the debates. Lee Wai-song was much more calm and able to be reserved. So she was the one who would more often do the big debates in the state. But they were really training the women how to build this confidence. It was a boot camp for conservative women to learn how to be effective lobbyists and organizers. So as this continues to go on, Georgia gets even more important because Carter gets to be president. And he really, when Carter was president, of course, we know Iran hostage crisis, he really needed a victory. So he was hoping the ERA could pass. There's so much pressure on him to pass the ERA in Georgia. So he sends his staff down, he sends his family down. They're really trying to get it. And his special assistant for women's affairs, Sarah Weddington, went down there, and her research came back that said there was strong lobbying by Stop ERA groups. They brought in hundreds of people and passed out sandwiches and cake and stayed there until they beat it down. Good lobbyists. And then reported that a legislator who did not want to be named reported, ERA has about as much chance of passing as I do of walking on Lake Lanier. A bleak outlook. Sorry. So the women in Georgia were able to prevent the amendment from even coming up in most sessions, but clearly keeping it defeated. And when the ERA finally failed in 1982, it remained 3 states shy of ratification. So I will stop there. I see that there's some questions. I think maybe if I do that, then my cursor comes back. Yeah. So I can see some of these questions. I see chat. Let's see what's happening. I have more I can talk about, but I just want to respect your time, and I really like discussion, so please come up with any other questions you have. I see one in Q&A, I think. Yes, I was at the Decatur Book Festival. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Denise. Um, the next book, I'm not quite sure. There's one character in the book, um, at the very end. She only gets like a page, but her name is Eliza King Pascal Morrison, an Agnes Scott alum. And I am really fascinated with her. She shifted. She was one of the founders of Atlanta National Organization for Women, and then comes out against ERA and sort of blows up the feminist scene in Atlanta. Eventually went to work for the Reagan White House. So I might be writing something about her. I'm not sure if it's an article or a book, but I'm not done with her yet. Um, and then yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I'm still kind of looking. I'm doing a lot of reading right now to figure out what the next thing is. Um, Georgia's political views on conservative women. I'm not exactly sure where you're coming from with that question, Janet, but yeah, I think that Georgia has very much, Georgia GOP especially, has very much relied on women's organizing, but they don't recognize how much they rely on it, right? One of the things I tell my students at Agnes Scott is my thesis for all of history, I'm just going to go there, is women do the work and men take the credit, right? I was just at the Puppetry Arts Center and I saw Charlotte's Web, and I was like, this is actually a story about how women do the work and men get the medals. Like, sorry, the spider literally worked herself to death and the pig got the medals. What's up with that? Um, but what I'm hoping this book can do is help people to see that women's conservatism is, number one, their choice, that it's something that many women are actively believing, are actively choosing to be involved in. And number two, recognizing these things as work, recognizing baking a cake is political work. Hosting a tea is political work. Registering your new neighbor when they move in, because they would have welcome baskets and go recruit their new neighbors. All of that is political work that I think we take for granted because we're so used to seeing the $1,000 plate fundraisers as politics, right? But really what happens, what I think moves the needle, is that local action, local grassroots engagement. And we still see that white women are the most consistent Republican voters in Georgia. So they came out something like, was it 70 or 75% for Brian Kemp, even more for Kemp than for Trump. Does the grassroots, Merwin is asking if the grassroots network used to defeat the ERA in Georgia still exists. So yes, I think it's probably not as many of the same women. There is still an Eagle Forum, which was of course Phyllis Schlafly's organization. There is still a very active Georgia Federation of Republican Women. And there's lots of different groups that have sort of been springing up. So they may not necessarily be in the same groups as their mothers or grandmothers, but we're still seeing women definitely being engaged in it as much as anyone is engaged. We have the problem now of sort of the lack of social engagement, right? There have been sociologists studying the famous bowling alone study that we're not joining bowling leagues. But I think we are still seeing people, particularly on certain issues, whether it's around abortion. We still see women really organizing on at least two sides of the abortion debate. There's probably more than two sides to it that we could acknowledge. And we're still seeing people, we're really seeing a reinvigoration of women being involved in schools and school textbooks, um, and really using this platform of motherhood as their as the springboard for political engagement, which is really what they are also doing in this project. Are there other questions?
I have a question, Rob.
Yeah.
So how did the ERA not passing, how did that affect our life today, in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, there's still every time we talk about gender discrimination in the workplace, we either have to find the right law to argue that with, or we have to write a new law to argue it. So we have changed a lot. So through the 1970s, partly because of the ERA discussion, women were able to get access to checking accounts, were able to get access to credit cards, able to get access to mortgages. But what we're still seeing is that women are getting worse credit. We're getting higher interest rates. We're getting rejected more often for loans. Women are still getting offered lower pay in the workplace. So if you're out there and you're applying for jobs, negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. Practice, take that lesson from Catherine Dunaway. Practice the meeting with your boss to negotiate. But yeah, we're still seeing a lot of this, and the laws that are saying you can't talk about, or the policies and the laws that protect those policies that say you can't talk about your salary at the workplace are really hurting women. And we've seen cases around that. And I think there's also an argument to be made that the abortion debate, that the protections of the Equal Rights Amendment may have protected the access to abortion and reproductive health care. That was actually one of the talking points that Schlafly used to say that this would write abortion into the law. So I think we still see it in a lot of ways that it comes up. Yeah, so Merwin is saying it sounds like, in my opinion, we still need the ERA. I did try very hard as I was writing to take myself out of it. And I could see so I could understand. So I wasn't always, when I was reading the Phyllis Schlafly report, I wasn't always arguing with her, but I was really actively trying to listen to her. I still think we do have some gender discrimination in the United States that we need to address. I will say I don't think the ERA has a shot right now. I know there's some people who want to bring it up again, or who say that we just need 3 states to pass. That's not where I'm going to spend my time right now, because I don't think it has a chance, and I think there's other work that can be more productive right now. But yeah, that was a challenge for me to go in and really try to be open-minded and listen to what the sources said. And ultimately, I really do think that these women are so worthy of our respect. And I think there is a real challenge to meet with people that you think you're not going to agree with, because there's always going to be something that you can find to respect. So, Phyllis Schlafly, hell of an organizer. The guilty verdict this week. I don't think so. I think the people who are with Trump. So Denise has written, I'm frustrated that most of my fellow Republican women don't spurn Trump. Do you think the guilty verdict this week will help open eyes? Yeah, I was finishing this book up as Trump was getting elected. If the pandemic hadn't hit, it would have been out a little earlier. But whew, that kind of threw me for a loop. I don't think so. I don't think that's going to help. I think the people who support Trump have already accepted so much, and have already chosen and will defend him. And I think the people who have spurned Trump are going to continue to do that. So But I do think that we're at an interesting place for the Republican Party where they are going to have to figure out who they are and what they are. Um, and it's interesting because in the early chapters of my book, I'm looking at 1964 and 1966 and what the party does after this huge loss because of the extremism of Barry Goldwater, who now when I teach Barry Goldwater, my students are like, "What do you mean he's extreme? He seems kind of, is he a Democrat?" So that's always a fun time to be teaching. But yeah, I think the party, it's going to be interesting to see in the next few months. As much as I think we all in Georgia have earned a real break from politics and text messaging and people knocking on my door, I think we've earned a real but I think we're going to see I have no idea what's going to happen with the Republican Party. I'm both exhausted and interested, so we'll see. Um, how can conservative women be more impactful? Um, I mean, I think you should check this book out of the library, and I think you can really see some good tips for organizing. And I think really focusing on that local level. I think that's also something that we've seen in at the end I talk some about Gwinnett County, and I know that Ellen Rafshoon, who's at Georgia Gwinnett College, is writing about the other side of the other women and the organizing in 2017. But I think that really focusing on the local issues, the local level, I think what they did so well in the 1970s really was that they started focusing on the school board, they started focusing on the state legislature, city council, all of those, because that's also where you vet candidates and where candidates kind of grow up. So I think that getting back to the grassroots and focusing on down ballot can be really important, no matter if you're conservative or liberal. I just think that's a really good strategy. How do we attract better, more reasonable candidates? I have no idea. Part of it with women, part of what it takes for women to run is for someone to ask them. And we see this with any job, that there will be 10 qualifications, and if men meet 2 of them, then they go in there acting like they were the CEO of something, and women will be like, I only meet 7 of the 10, I don't think I can apply. So it's the same with politics as it is with work, that women tend to be asked. So I did some oral histories before the pandemic, and that's another project I might return to, of interviewing women in office all over the South. And what they had in common was that someone had asked them to run. And that includes, a Republican councilwoman in Mississippi. It includes Stacey Abrams, a mayor in Tennessee. So this is something that they all had in common, with someone recognizing that potential and encouraging them to run. I also think we might need to be a little bit more forgiving about people's teens and 20s, because I think if you're doing college right, you've done something to be embarrassed about. I try to tell my students, just be sure there's not a camera when you do it. But I think we need to be more forgiving of people's mistakes, and also, as a culture, let people recover from mistakes, acknowledge them, change their minds, move on. We're not very good at letting people change their minds. We call that flip-flopping or whatever, but I think we need to do better, just as a whole body politic. I know. Thank God I am not the person I was in my teens and 20s, right? I mean, I had some fun. I learned a lot. I was a middle school teacher in my 20s. And those kids are now in their 30s. I can't believe it. But yeah, I think we need to have that space for people to grow and change. But also, you know, there should be like a basic minimum, like don't lie about your family and the Holocaust kind of thing. Given the news that came out today about Santos, you know, there's like don't flip flop about the facts, but you can change your mind on policies or laws or, you know, there's a lot. I would love to meet you all in person. This is fun. So I mentioned briefly that the book does go back. It starts actually in in the very beginning. It starts with the Black women who started the Republican Party in Georgia, who started the Georgia Federation of Republican Women, and then they lose control in 1964 with Barry Goldwater. There's also an African American Republican women's group in Atlanta that I just loved, and they had some of my favorite pictures. So if you check the book out, I hope you enjoy those at the Salute to America parade. So I hope you really, I can just show you real quick. There they are. Celebrating all of the things the GOP did for the African American women. So I love that picture. That was my favorite. And I got that from the Auburn Avenue Research Library. So shout out to the librarians. I could not have done this without archivists all over the country. But yeah, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to meet you in person. I'm in Atlanta, so I can come talk to your program anytime.
Well, yeah, it looks like a lot of people would be interested in seeing you in person, hearing you in person, which I wish we could have done.
Yeah.
But
This
it,
also means everyone could be here, so.
yeah, it's always nice. But if there are no other questions, then I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Robin, for your time, for that wonderful presentation. Definitely learned a lot of information that I didn't know. But you know, women out there doing something, and that's, I mean, more power to them, you know.
Power to the women.
Yes. Um, Again, we thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Robin, and we hope you all have a great evening.
Thanks so much.